Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. It's so great to be back with you on the HFE Hub. I'm really excited today because I'm chatting with Kate Conroy today, and Kate is one of our keynote speakers at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society conference scheduled for November this year. So, Kate, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today. And I wanted to talk to you about your career in human factors and how that started.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My first exposure to human factors as an academic discipline or a profession was actually when a Defence Science and Technology group put out an advertisement for a social and ethical robotics researcher role. It was a permanent APS job, and it was working inside the human factors team. And previously, as a philosopher, so I have a PhD in philosophy and a graduate certificate in cognitive science. So I've got a strong cognitive science background, and the disciplines that comprise cognitive science include artificial intelligence, linguistics, philosophy, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and anthropology. Those are the sort of traditional six that were sort of put forward as the ones we need to pay attention to kind of understand the human mind and then understand what the artificial mind might be back in the day. So human factors was a new thing for me. I had no idea. So, of course, I was intrigued and I thought, wow, a permanent job in science, working with a team that care about human beings, but also in a applied sort of context was fascinating to me. And my team were all just so terrific, but also quite diverse themselves. And, you know, some of them were able to do eye tracking to find out, and they had these theories about how attention could be tracked and then what attention meant in terms of cognitive workload, theories of situational awareness. And it was different. It was different to what I knew from my academic background, but was exciting because I was like, oh, there's a whole other area of, you know, people thinking about this stuff from a different way. And the core difference for me between human factors research and the more traditional philosophy that I've done is in that naturalistic decision-making methodologies. And I really found that very inspirational because a lot of the reasons I was not I didn't pursue cognitive psychology as an academic was that I really felt that you didn't have contextually valid experimental design. In order to make assumptions or make assertions about the limits of human cognition, rationality, and abilities to reason, whereas naturalistic decision-making, that is the backstop of a lot of human factors methods, like task analysis, you know, that really goes to humans where they make decisions and where they are thinking through problems and where they're actually trying to intersect themselves into a context to achieve some outcome or some end. And I was like, oh, well, that's really important. So let me learn as much as I can and try to contribute to the team in that first role.
Amongst your skills, you have a specific interest in artificial intelligence. And I wondered if you could tell us about your work, because I understand it's in safety and assurance in the AI space.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I come from a cognitive science background, and I've always been interested at where human beings are the right things to be making decisions and how we can augment human beings in the systems and the machines that we build. Obviously, the rise of artificial intelligence becoming quite useful since 2010 with sort of computational power from the infrastructure of computers and the chips, and then the machine learning algorithms applied to this computational power with huge data assets sort of accelerated AI as something practical, but left all these philosophical and ethical questions unresolved. And so I just happened to be in the right place at the right time after having my children to benefit from AI turning up and being useful, and some of my sort of skills being relevant to trying to figure out how to best use these AI products. So my first job in AI was really that Defence Science and Technology group job. And I just happened to be in the right place in the right time when the Trusted Autonomous Systems Defence Cooperative Research Centre got set up, the CRC, where they were focused on the trust aspects of autonomous systems used for defence purposes. And that was very interesting to me. And I sort of leapt at that opportunity and really was able in that job to come up with frameworks to guide ethical AI in defence contexts, and also think about regulatory factors applying to the use of autonomous systems in a civilian domain as well, in maritime, air and land. And so we built the RAS Gateway. So it's rasgateway.com.au or just .au. And it was about those regulatory pathways for autonomous systems in Australia, like how you can actually get yourself through the safety considerations in autonomous systems in that role. And at TAS, we did so many things. We built, did the Ethics Uplift program. We funded work in the ethics and law of trusted autonomous systems, so looking at international humanitarian law obligations and how that might apply to the use of autonomy. We just invested in fellows, and we developed human AI safety teaming frameworks, and working with the industry to actually build these frameworks into the technologies as they were getting developed, which was really exciting. And then following on from TAS, I've had opportunities actually to join the Royal Australian Air Force as a reservist, which is a great honour. And so now I get to serve my country as responsible AI lead for the Royal Australian Air Force, benefiting from some of my experiences in defence today. But contributing, in uniform. And also the Queensland government last year, with the rise of generative AI, they sort of thought, wow, this could be really terrific, but we can see the warning signs. And so they wanted to lift not only the access to these generative AI tools for the Queensland government public service, but at the same time building frameworks that were really useful and to help us identify risks with the use of AI in the public domain. So that we could do that balance between adoption and managing that trust relationship with the Australian public.
You mentioned generative AI. So I'm just wondering, are there different types of AI that are being used? Is probably a good question to start with.
So there's definitely AI being used across the board, across many aspects of different organisations. I think generative AI is the more dominant one because of how easy it is for the ordinary person who has no background training to pick it up, and also how general it is. So it's both easy to use and it can be used for a huge range of different functions. And so that's the one that's definitely getting the most attention and potentially the most adoption by the greatest diversity of people who are working inside organisations. But yes, there will be different types of AI being used across the board. Scientists have been using machine learning algorithms to do classification in science for a long time. So for them, a lot of this stuff is, old news. But the particular use of artificial intelligence for reasoning and decision making is very much in the generative AI bucket for now. Those systems are getting tweaked, and there are certainly a lot of new designs coming out that are trying to pull together these generative AI systems that are built on sort of a kind of dumb process, which is actually association and attention. There's nothing very intelligent about any particular correlation that yields the prediction in generative AI. But what makes it also powerful is the layers of the software systems and the incredible amount of data that's been fed into them and the cleverness of pulling that together with computational power. So you kind of this emergently amazing thing, but it doesn't understand reasoning, it doesn't understand causality, it doesn't have the true breadth of imaginative capacity that human beings have and our ability to change statistical weights in our imagination. It's still very beholden to the data it's been trained in. And this was really well exemplified by, earlier this year, if you asked for one banana in one of these AI imagery tools, it would always give you a bunch of bananas. It couldn't provide you just one banana. So the one banana problem was a really good example of how difficult it is to get these AI systems to go outside of the data sets, the constraints of the data on which they've been trained. And so they're really, really good at replicating stuff that's very statistically likely in the corpus of knowledge of the internet, but are not very good at doing things that are different to the way things have been done before. And if we think about progress and innovation and wanting to become a more, diverse, inclusive, equitable society, then so much of the bias that comes with our data sets being lumpy in these particular ways, we're just exacerbating and repeating and enhancing those biases. And of course, we get that in hiring biases with AI, where these, if you use AI to look through people's resumes, they're often going to pick out people who have been traditionally successful and are not necessarily very good at flagging potential in an underrepresented applicant who might be really great for the role, but really needs that human mindset in order to break through the prejudice and the bias of the AI systems.
Okay, so when we're looking at generative AI, are we looking at AI that relies on machine learning from data?
Yeah, it's probably not a good idea for us to try and get to the technical details of exactly how AI works, to be completely honest, for your audience, but also for the time we have. There's some really great resources to get sort of some jumpstart on the technical architecture that is behind some of these generative AI tools. But when it comes to human factors, I think it's important for us to realize that we're all using tools like Google Maps, and we have theories about Google Maps and when it works and when it doesn't work and when it's reliable and when we shouldn't use it. We have theories about all of that without knowing anything about the technical underpinnings of the product. And so when we're providing guidance in organizations about how to use AI tools, actually knowing truly how these work is potentially less useful than understanding how they operate in a particular context of use, who's in charge of them, who's responsible for making decisions with them, and then coming up with a framework for responsible and reasonable use of these systems, given what you know about their behaviours. And so if you don't know how something's going to behave, like some of these generative AI models using your organisational data, then you're going to need some form of sandbox system to try and constrain them, like looking at a strange alien animal that you've only just caught from the wild. You probably don't want to put that animal into your house and just let it rummage around. It might poop everywhere. So you probably want to put it in a cage and actually sort of observe it and try to understand it better. And so the moment we're in with AI is probably less about everybody understanding technically how AI works and more about understanding what do we do with something that we don't understand how it works? Like, how do we manage that? Because something that really stood out for me going to the Cognitive Science Society's conference in 2023, so a year ago, was seeing a whole bunch of people who I absolutely look up to in that field who've been doing computational linguistics for decades and decades, right, and have been in this artificial intelligence field for decades, and looking at what their response to these generative AI tools, okay, and their response to them was just one of like incredulity, like looking up at these giant generative AI brains that they didn't understand from an alien sort of non-sentient intelligence. And they were doing all these experiments with them themselves to try to understand, how they worked and why they worked. And, if the best leading computational linguists can't understand these systems in their experiments and explorations, then none of us really are going to have any chance. And they're so big, they're so massive, their parameters are unable to be grasped by human beings. 90 billion parameters. There's no chance that we're really going to be able to understand them thoroughly or be able to predict them well. So the best chance we have is on the kind of cages or the kind of responsible use patterns to embark on an exploration of their capabilities.
Okay, so we don't know how these AI systems behave. That's some of the things that you've mentioned there. And there's significant limitations with this. So how do we regulate something that we don't understand?
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to regulate things that we don't understand. It's not so much that we don't understand them. Some people do understand them, but it gets to your point about behaviours. How predictable are their behaviours? These are not deterministic systems. They're not deterministic automated systems that always do the same thing under the same conditions. So there's a huge range of responses to how to regulate them. And again, I don't think we have enough time in the podcast to really go through all of the different ways that have been proposed. But let's just divide the potential here between soft and hard regulation. So hard regulation is, what we have in, privacy law, and, there are things, international humanitarian law, there are things that are legal and there are things that are illegal. Soft regulation is more like having almost etiquette or best practice or expected ways of behaving in order to be a good actor or a good agent in this field. And the softer approach, Australia has embarked on with things like Australia's AI ethics principles that in 2019 were sort of part of the early forays into trying to regulate through soft regulation. They were voluntary. People felt at the time maybe they're not going to be effective. Maybe they're not going to do anything. They're just, motherhood statements, useless, But in fact, they have been nourished. They've been utilised in a lot of different frameworks since, like the Commonwealth Ombudsman's Automated Decision Making Best Practice Guide. They incorporated into CSIRO's advice and frameworks and governance approaches. And now here we are, 2024, and those Australian AI ethics principles are really baked into a lot of our ways of thinking about AI risk and for government decision-making as well as industry decision-making. And we also have standards that people can comply with in order to build trust with their stakeholders. So if you're an organisation and you want to say, I'm a trustworthy organisation to be using artificial intelligence, then you have the Australian Voluntary AI Safety Standard to comply with. If you can comply with that standard, that's going to set you apart from other organisations. And if I have a choice between working with a vendor who complies with the safety standard to someone who does not, I will absolutely go with someone who's put the effort in to comply with the standard, because I don't want my own reputation to be at risk by working with vendors who themselves are not able to manage their safety risks. So safety culture goes a lot broader than laws. And I think when we think about safety culture and mechanisms of safety, they go all the way from legislation and laws all the way down to the conversations we have and the way we expect to interact with each other, on the factory floor, as it were. And safety culture is about having values of safety and supporting each other and expecting safety briefings and expecting safety adherence and prioritization. So I think there's a lot that we're doing in AI safety that isn't hard regulation, and that's really good. So there's lots of different ways to improve the way we use AI.
So we've jumped ahead a bit. It might be good to step back a little bit and just talk about some of the limitations with AI in terms of situational awareness or complexity. What are some of the limitations we have with AI?
So AI is often very brittle, traditional machine learning models. So they might have been trained on a particular data set and reliable to do certain types of tasks, but really not able to be used effectively in other contexts. So a good example of that would be the current large language models available through like ChatGPT are probably really good at helping an American student write an Abraham Lincoln assignment, because there's so much data on the internet about Abraham Lincoln. It's very American-centric, English-centric, and so it's probably going to do a pretty decent job and have lots of information to draw from. But if you're writing an essay on Mrs. Mack, Australia's first female electrical engineer in the mid-20th century, it's probably going to do a poor job because it doesn't have access to that much data. So there's so much data that these models don't have. They are incredibly biased. And if what we're looking to do, for example, is promote Australian values, culture, history, impact and influence, and we want our children to learn about Australian literary figures and Australian scientists and engineers and politicians and First Nations history, cultures and languages, these AIs are going to be really bad at them. And so one of the dangers of AI is where we import other people's AI products and think that they should be used in all parts of our society. What we're basically saying is that this kind of generic AI products are more important than fostering and developing our own sovereign data, our own sovereign AI products that are built on our data that actually enhance and improve Australian decision-making using Australian values and data and history and culture. So one danger of AI at the moment is that people are getting sucked into using it and becoming very homogenized. We know from Micah Ensley's paper, The Ironies of Artificial Intelligence, that some of the risks of AI is that it seems really like a human cognitive friend, and that tricks us and it actually disarms us. And so the information produced by these generative AI systems actually reduce our critical faculties, stop us from questioning the information in a way that we might question it if it came out of something that didn't seem so anthropomorphically similar to us. So it actually reduces our ability to be critical of it. And at the same time, they're very unreliable and they make up information and they make up ideas. So you've got something that's an unreliable technology that nevertheless makes you think that it's very reliable. And some philosophers have compared this to a very famous argument on bullshit by Harry Frankfurt. And the idea here is that when you are a bullshitter, when you're a bullshitter, what you don't really care about truth, you care about impact and influence. And you will basically put things together and say all kinds of different things to achieve your endeavor, regardless of whether what you're saying is actually true or verified. So you have an unreliable system that is very biased, that stops us from thinking critically. But is very, very attractive. And so it's really up to us as a society to start to think about what do we actually want out of human beings and their cognition, what should we hold on to, and what can we let go of. Nobody wants to go back to slide rulers to do mathematical, calculations. We all love using calculators now. So maybe there's some things we don't need to hold on to, but really understanding the balance between what we need to hold on to versus what we don't is where we're still at as a society. And Nietzsche said, when you look into the abyss looks back into you. And I take that with generative AI as being when you put information into generative AI with your prompts, you need to rely on your knowledge, your memory, your values, what you think is important, what you think is worth thinking about. And if we are not educating ourselves in the knowledge of the data and the right things to prompt with, then the abyss is going to just send us back out very low quality information. So education around real information and real values still incredibly paramount, even if we get these AIs in the future to help us, make the process of delivery of information more efficient.
So what you've really explained is kind of garbage in, garbage out, which means, if the garbage, if that's the data that's in the system, then that's what's regurgitated.
Yeah, absolutely. And if what you do find is there's racism in the systems. So if you've got lower educated people who speak in a certain sort of way, the AIs will not give them back information of high quality because they are very vulnerable to the way that they're prompted. And it has a huge impact, potentially a huge impact, exacerbating lack of opportunity as well. But it could also be flip side, used to help people who find writing English difficult, help them write English in a way that's more aligned to the power structures of our society. So that's the flip side. If you don't know how to write English sentences well and you're trying to get an impactful change and you know that the people in power speak in a certain way, generative AI is probably, at least in Australia, going to help you access that way of speaking.
Okay, so if we are designing systems in industry for various purposes, and clearly we've established that the data that you put in has to be reliable, one of the problems with AI, I believe, is that it doesn't conform to mental models, does it? So the way we would make decisions is not the way AI necessarily makes decisions, and this can lead to, catastrophic outcomes.
Yeah, you're definitely onto something about the AI not having a mental model. The AI doesn't have any sense of us as cognitive agents and just seems like something that has that kind of capacity. And so certainly, there are huge dangers in using, these systems without monitoring and care. I think we're getting better at developing prompts that would help get the generative AI to be more aligned with what we need. And so a lot of prompt engineering is actually kind of explaining to AI the way we want it to behave. It's not the same as the AI having a mental model of us, but certainly through prompt engineering and also RAG, so this retrieval augmented generation, this is a way you can package information to be run through the generative AI product to be more aligned to the kinds of information you'd like to see prioritized. So these two techniques, prompt engineering and RAGs, they both are attempts to basically sway the prediction machine of the AI to be more aligned with the type of information and the approach, the style of communication that you want. But it is a bit of an uncanny valley, and there's definitely a point where you realize you're still dealing with a non-clever thing that is very good at coming out with clever sounding stuff.
Why do you think we really need it?
Have you tried it, Sharon?
Absolutely. Google Maps. Yep, all the time. Can't live without it. In industry, however, obviously I'm not flying a plane. I can't live without Google Maps.
Yeah, so AI is here to stay and is ubiquitous in all of our lives, in our smartphones and the way we live our lives. And industry is using it all the time as well through the people who are using it all the time. in whether they're using it authorised or unauthorised. People are finding their path through utilising these tools. No one's going to go back. People are going to continue to use this stuff. But everyone's going to find their path in terms of where they get a value out of these products and when they decide to put them down. So, for example, in my work, I explored the supposed ability of these systems to take meeting transcripts and then make meeting minutes from them. And I found that, in fact, these generative AI tools are incredibly unreliable at making good minutes, because actually making good minutes requires you to understand the politics of a conversation and actually understanding that particular people who make an assertion in the room, capturing exactly what they said, not just a generative AI word salad of what they said, but the actual words they said is really critical to capture. And that generative AI will often just make up the difference between a law versus a framework versus a standard. But you actually, for minutes, particularly in administrative decision-making, you need your minutes to actually record what the words were that people say. And so having an automated minute-making device, it seems like a productivity advantage. It would be if it was reliable and trustworthy. So now I just will not use generative AI to make minutes, but I will take a little bit of a transcript, like a couple of sentences, and I will actually ask the generative AI, I'll say, could you please turn this piece of transcript into information better presented as a paragraph? And it can change the grammar from, transcript ease, which is quite bitty and often grammatically a little bit problematic when it's written down, but not problematic when we listen to it. And so that translation from an oral representation to a written narrative, it can often do a good job very quickly on that. And also, because it's a very small chunk, like a couple of sentences, I can apply my English education to evaluate fidelity. Like, is the message coming across here in a way that I would vouch for that was what that person intended to say in that meeting? So I will use generative AI, but I use it in a way that's quite complicated and not just the simplistic marketing way of using it that you often hear from companies and people who think it's going to radically change our lives. And the Digital Transformation Agency just released their analysis of use of Microsoft Copilot in the federal government. It happened in 2024, and they definitely spoke to people saying it did help them with their documents and productivity, but they also pointed out that there was a productivity loss where some people were having to go back and actually spend so much time repairing the generative AI that it was either taking them more time if they used the tool than less, or not providing a productivity advantage at all.
You've stepped on something really interesting there, because we want AI to make it easier, i.e. the navigation system, but it can often make it more complex when it leads you up the garden path or leads you somewhere where you don't want to be. And that's because it's obviously relying on data which we're unaware of, and we have little control over it. So how can we improve these systems so that they're less likely to be making life more complex for us?
We're not going to be able to reduce the problems of generative AI qua generative AI. So the current generation of generative AI products, you cannot make them safe, you cannot make them reliable, you must not use them in any safety critical functionality in any system that you're working with. Just don't do it. There's not any formal way to make them reliable. There's no verification or validation or tests you can do that would stop them making things up and changing meaning and changing ideas. That's just the kind of technology it is. So just knowing where to use different types of AI and understanding where AI is reliable and making sure that you put the right kinds of systems in place to help with decision making, and that you don't drink the Kool-Aid with companies selling products, making it seem as though we've actually got anything close to artificial general intelligence or any form of alignment to cognitive capacities that a normal human being in a normal line of work would do without even worrying about it. So everyone needs to have expertise in the organisation that is human factors expertise and energy towards actually making sure that the AI risks, particularly the socio-technical AI risks, are constantly being thought about and mitigated in order to avoid utilising these AI systems in ways that would genuinely harm people and systems.
Lots of things to think about in this area, and I'm wondering what you're talking about at the conference.
There's been so much that's happened in the last year in government thinking about AI and AI risks. So in my keynote for the conference, I thought what I would do is start off by thinking about what has been done to think about AI risks that would be relatable by the audience. So I'm particularly looking at Micah Ensley's work on the ironies of artificial intelligence that was published in the journal Ergonomics last year. And also looking at a Workplace New South Wales workplace health and safety AI risk scorecard that was developed a couple of years ago. But what I love about it is that they really took seriously safety frameworks and then thought through different AI risks with a really, good methodology, really smart methodology. And I wanted to talk to the audience about some of the findings from these two pieces of research work that I thought was connected to the human factors and ergonomics community, and then think about those ideas through the lens of some of the frameworks that have been released in the federal government as well as the state government of Queensland, where I'm working, to think about AI risks and to basically introduce the audience to these frameworks as well as Australia's AI safety standard, and to point out ways to connect, basically where you can go from being in that human factors and ergonomics profession and where the place of impact could be for you in working with organisations who are dealing with the risks of the human factors risks of bringing artificial intelligence into operations. So basically helping connect people and hopefully being informative and having a good time.
That sounds really great.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.